In this 47th episode of Alexander Studies Online, we're joined by members of the Society of Teachers of the Alexander Technique Research Group. Leslie Glover, Charlotte Woods, Erica Donison, Julia Woodman, and Mark Vasak to discuss self-report outcome measures. Widely used in research and healthcare, these tools allow individuals to share personal insights into their experiences, behaviors, and health. We explore examples like patient report outcome measures or PROMs, which capture patient self-assessments, and the Measure Yourself Medical Outcome Profile or MYMOP, which helps patients track the outcomes that matter most to them. Join us for a discussion that highlights unique insights, challenges, and future possibilities for using self-report measures to better understand and communicate the process and change associated with learning the Alexander technique.
I think we should give a bit of context on some of the different types of questionnaires that people could use or different tools that they might use in research.
Well, is it worth sort of thinking of dividing types of measures into three very broad categories? So you have ones that are designed to measure a particular construct. So you might have depression measure or an anxiety measure or a pain measure or a pain self-efficacy measure. And those are ones that have been constructed and tested to see if they're reliable, to see if they're measuring what it is they're meant to be measuring, and whether they can discern the difference between what it is they're meant to be measuring and something that's maybe similar but different. So you have those questionnaires which are formalized, standardized, and tried and tested, if you like. And then you have measures like the MYMOP, which are standardized in the sense that everyone gets the same questions and the same kind of structure of the questionnaire, and it's been tried and tested and widely used. So it's, again, something that is formalized in a way, but people provide their own things to measure, their own outcomes. And then in the third one, and the kind of questionnaire we used in the survey, we designed the questionnaire in order to ask the questions that we wanted. So we were seeking information rather than measuring something, if you like. That's something where we created the questions to find out what we wanted to know. So they're self-report, people are saying what they think, but they're not in any way validated, or they're not measuring a construct. They're gaining information.
Yeah, I think we have to be a bit careful with using the term self-report, because to my mind, just about any questionnaire is actually self-report in the old-fashioned sense of the word. You know, the person is reporting something subjective about what they think or feel or believe, whereas MYMOP is quite different. As Leslie says, in that questionnaires like that, the participant is actually saying what they want to be measured, whereas the kind of survey questionnaire that Leslie was talking about, having done on dementia and caring, that went out to a lot of Alexander Technique teachers, that agenda was set by the designers of the questionnaire. You wanted specific information, and the participant wasn't providing, the outcomes or whatever they were going to be measured. They're very different kinds of questionnaire, I would say.
Well, I suppose what I could say about the survey is that when you put together a survey like that, it sounds like maybe we just sat down with the back of an envelope one day and thought, we'll ask a few questions and these sound like good ones. And it was much more thinking about what our research questions were. We wanted to know about how many Alexander teachers had experience of teaching people with dementia, how many had experience of teaching carers. We wanted to know about the attitudes and the knowledge and the thoughts teachers had about teaching people. So it was created in an attempt to gain data about specific questions, but we would also be thinking about it in the context of the research around dementia. Some of the ideas, thoughts, information about people's attitude towards people with dementia in other settings. So we were creating the questions, but drawing on the research that we had from other areas to direct how we wanted to ask them and what particular elements we wanted to ask about.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I think any questionnaire like that, you need a lot of background knowledge and you need a pilot and all that kind of thing before you can sort of launch it in that kind of large scale way. You have to think about the questions, but it may just be one or two questions that are good ones. And then the person talks, but then you got this kind of, oh my God, I've got all this data. What am I going to do with it?
So I think it's been at least a couple of decades, probably a bit more, that self-report measures have been used in clinical studies, particularly in where there's chronic health conditions. There's been a recognition that you can't just try and objectively measure symptoms and signs, and it's actually quite important to find out what people think themselves. So patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs, now form an integral part of many clinical studies, particularly in chronic conditions. And that's certainly what we've used in some of the Alexander-related clinical trials. Leslie made the point about the 3 different types of self-report. So my experience is on the opposite end of what you were doing in the Atlas trial, when you were really looking at something to measure the effectiveness of an intervention. But even then, it takes a lot of work to figure out what is the best outcome measure to use. And, we all know there have been instances in trials where, we think we've got the right measure and then actually doesn't really show us the expected result. Like the A-team trial with the Roland Morris outcome measure, that was amazing because it gave very clear data, very clear outcome. And in Atlas, the neck pain trial, the primary outcome measure was, again, it was a patient self-report that on the face of it looked very similar to the Roland Morris. It was about disability associated with the pain and the pain itself. But even though the outcome measure was very sort of similar, the results weren't quite so like, wow, there's so many different factors involved. So obviously chronic neck pain's a heck of a lot more difficult to deal with than back pain overall. But the important thing about it is, because it was a validated measure, as is Roland Morris, then you can make statistical comparisons and you can make conclusions, and can draw conclusions from that. So I think some of the measures might seem a bit dry looking at them, but it depends why you're doing this. If you're trying to convince NICE or the NHS or whatever, then you need to use well-recognized measures. So finding the right ones is it's not straightforward, and it requires a heck of a lot of research and piloting before you actually get going.
Adding on to that, some of them have to be administered by somebody who's got practice or has been certified with certain assessments, be it a physician, be it a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist. And as you've all talked about, it really is getting clear on the population. For instance, there's a huge range of assessments. So it's not just picking one off and saying, I'm going to use this. You need to know who you're going to use it for. Are you qualified to use it? Do you need somebody else's help? Just to echo what Julia said, it's actually quite a challenge. And some places use very specific tools in very specific settings.
And I think you have to be aware as well and be mindful of how people who are taking part use the assessment themselves. Because if you have, scales where you're asking someone to rate the level of their pain, say, on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is no pain at all, 10 is the worst they can imagine, then 5, 10, 15, however many people with nobody has the same experience, but what you might call a similar level might score that completely differently. So one person's mild pain might be a 2, but someone else's mild pain might be a 4 or a 6. And so you also have to think about, when you're using them, are you comparing the same person's score against their score after? So, is it a before and after where you're comparing themselves against themselves?
Yes, or it's a very large randomized trial, in which case it'll all wash out. The numbers are so big that it will average out across, and then you don't need to compare the individuals against their own baseline. You can compare them against the control group.
I think that's one of the dangers with people maybe who don't have a background, much training in terms of doing research, is they do tend to sort of do a lot of averaging out, maybe of relatively small numbers of cases. And because percentages are very persuasive, numbers are very persuasive, so they'll be talking about, 80% of respondents did this, but when the population's tiny, that's kind of essentially meaningless and could be a massive distortion.
We keep coming back to the same old thing, really. It's like there's a big difference between what is achievable in a big academics or industry setting and what a small group of academics can do without a lot of resources. But, again, I think it's just about being clear what your research aims on, choosing the most appropriate methodology. What we haven't really talked about so much is the personal research, using things like MYMOPs, where you're not doing it in order to show, that this works better than that or doesn't, but you're doing it for more sort of generating information. Erica, do you want to talk about your experience of MYMOPs?
In the research project, it wasn't a research project, it just happened to be working with a lot of people with neurological conditions. I thought it would be useful to use MYMOP just to see whether there was any obvious changes. And the main reason for doing that was to be able to show the funders that there was a good outcome for the people who'd taken part, that they were hoping to help. I find MYMOP quite an interesting one because people do get the chance to put down their own symptom that is worrying them the most. So that means that it's individual. It's however many people you've got in the study you're doing, you could have that many different things that they're putting down. So you're not comparing conditions or reactions to changes in a particular condition. You're showing that the intervention that you're using is the data that you get out of it is, as I say, very individual.
So one of the things I'd found frustrating about it was that by getting the participant to decide what they were going to be measured on, what sort of changes were going to be looked at. And they didn't really change. They changed a bit, but they had really, really, really significant changes, which they kind of mentioned en passant. Oh, yeah. And by the way, my surgeon said that I was going to have back pain for the rest of my life. My back pain's gone, things like that. But they kind of dismissed that because they were only, they were focusing on those other relatively minor details.
I think that's the problem, isn't it? If you're sitting with them when they fill the form in, and I had the example of somebody putting down tinnitus, and I thought, oh dear, that's probably not going to be helped by the Alexander technique, and he did, to be fair, he did change it and put something else and did find the lessons to be of great benefit. But I suspect that if I'd left him with the tinnitus symptom, we might not have recorded as many benefits as he actually did. The other thing I did in my little project was I designed my own little questionnaire, which was basically a yes/no. So I had to come up with lots of things like, did these lessons help you with this? Because I was working with people some of whom had like cognitive impairment and things like that. So I couldn't make it hideously complicated. And a lot of them couldn't write because they'd had a stroke. So I wasn't able to use a questionnaire that invited them to write their own thoughts. It needed to be something that they could just circle on a piece of paper. So I think there's a lot of thinking around the population that you're asking to fill in the questionnaire, of what they're capable of and, how you can administer it.
That's the issue as well, that when filling in something like a MYMOP, people don't know what the possibilities for change are. So you might start with a particular issue, and actually you may not completely solve that issue, but actually the other changes that you never imagined would be possible kind of outweigh that. So there is something about how do you measure change in something that people don't know is going to change.
Wouldn't it be great if we actually could devise an outcome measure that any teacher could give to all their clients at the beginning, and then it would actually, because it's not just trying to create data for publications and all the rest and, get respectability in the outer world. It's also, like, as we know from the nature of the Alexander technique, some of these changes are quite small. Some of them are subtle. Some are not subtle, but they take a long time. So people forget. So wouldn't it be lovely to be able to, with your individual client in front of you, to say, oh, look at how this has changed to how it was last year.
I think the amazing thing about some of these assessments is it can actually expand how we understand the Alexander technique, so that we're not just assessing, say, an outcome for back pain or neck pain, as important as that is, but we're starting to see other effects on things like daily function, mobility, quality of life, other impacts on social relationships. We can start to understand how the work can impact life in a very holistic way.